My name is James Wilson. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 30 years working as a high school science teacher while raising my son Nathan as a single father after his mother left when he was just 7. Teaching wasn't glamorous or lucrative, but it allowed me to be present for my son, coaching his science competitions, attending his baseball games, and making sure dinner was on the table every night. I never missed a parent-teacher conference or a school play, balancing my own classroom responsibilities with his needs through careful planning and many late nights grading papers after he'd gone to bed. 3 years ago, Nathan was struggling to launch his tech startup after 2 previous business failures. During a particularly heated argument in my living room, he blamed me for his lack of success. "If you had pushed me harder," he shouted, his face flushed with frustration, "or had any business connections, or saved enough to really invest in me, maybe I wouldn't keep failing." I stood there, absorbing his words like body blows, thinking of the second mortgage I'd taken out to pay for his college, the retirement funds I'd dipped into to help with his first startup, the countless nights I'd stayed up helping him prepare presentations. But I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only response to pain disguised as anger. I let him vent his disappointment, watching as the bright, curious boy I'd raised transformed momentarily into a bitter man looking for someone to blame. When he finally ran out of steam, I simply asked if he wanted some dinner. He declined and left, the silence between us heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Last month, Nathan's company finally succeeded beyond anyone's expectations with a major acquisition by a tech giant. The small software platform he'd built to help independent retailers compete with larger chains had caught the attention of a Silicon Valley behemoth, resulting in a multi-million-dollar deal and positions for his entire team within the larger company. At the celebration party, held in an upscale hotel ballroom filled with investors and industry luminaries, Nathan gave a 20-minute speech thanking his investors, his team, his girlfriend, his college roommate who had introduced him to coding, and even his high school baseball coach for teaching him perseverance. My name never left his lips, though I stood quietly in the back of the room, still showing up as I always had. No one in that glittering crowd knew that I had reviewed his first business plan late into the night, red pen in hand just like I marked student papers. They didn't know about the garage I'd converted to a makeshift office for his first failed startup, or how I'd driven him to investor meetings when his car broke down. They didn't know that the confidence with which he now addressed crowds had been nurtured through science fair presentations I'd helped him practice again and again in our living room. What would you do if the child you sacrificed everything for couldn't acknowledge your contribution to their success? How do you reconcile the pride you feel for their achievements with the hurt of being erased from their story? Is silent support truly valuable if it goes unrecognized, or does the lack of acknowledgement somehow diminish the giving? Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to hit like if you've ever supported someone who couldn't or wouldn't recognize your sacrifice. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between defending your contributions and simply letting someone you love have their moment, even if that moment excludes you from the narrative? Let me take you back to where it all began, to help you understand the journey that brought us to that celebration party and the complex emotions I felt watching my son's triumph from the shadows. 3 years ago, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, Nathan arrived at my modest 2-bedroom home unannounced. The house was the same one we'd lived in since he was a child, nothing fancy, but located in a good school district with a yard where he'd practiced baseball for countless hours. The paint was fading in spots, the kitchen appliances outdated, but every surface held memories. The height marks on the doorframe, the dent in the wall from an indoor science experiment gone wrong, the scratched kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together. I was grading papers at that same kitchen table when I heard his car door slam. Through the window, I could see him stalking up the walkway, his expensive leather jacket and designer sunglasses at odds with the obvious tension in his shoulders. Nathan had always been intense, brilliant but volatile, quick to celebrate success and quicker to assign blame for failure. The maple tree in the front yard was shedding its crimson leaves across the lawn I'd raked just yesterday. That tree had supported a rope swing when Nathan was young, then a hammock during his teenage years where he'd read science fiction novels for hours. Now it simply dropped leaves for me to gather alone, a quiet reminder of seasons changing and children growing up. The smell of the beef stew I'd put in the slow cooker earlier filled the house, a simple comfort food I'd made regularly when he was growing up, especially during tough times. The recipe had been a staple during the lean years after his mother left, when I was stretching a teacher's salary to cover a mortgage, childcare, and the extracurricular activities Nathan needed to thrive. There was something steadying about the familiar scent of herbs and meat and vegetables melding together, a reminder that nourishment comes in simple forms. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the faded curtains his mother had sewn before she left, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Those curtains should have been replaced years ago, but I kept them as one of the few tangible remnants of the brief time we'd been a complete family. My old tabby cat, Einstein, dozed on the windowsill, unbothered by the impending storm I could sense in my son's approach. On the mantel above the small fireplace, photographs chronicled Nathan's journey from gap-toothed child to university graduate. Science fair trophies sat alongside baseball participation medals, testaments to a childhood I'd tried to make as normal and enriching as possible despite our circumstances. My teaching awards were tucked on a small shelf in the corner, modest recognition for decades of service that had never translated into the kind of success Nathan seemed determined to achieve. The door opened without a knock. Nathan still had a key, though he rarely visited anymore. The sound of his heavy footsteps on the worn hardwood floors brought me back to when those same floors had echoed with the sound of a teenager's stomping retreat during arguments about curfews and homework. Some patterns persist across decades, I thought, removing my reading glasses and setting aside the half-graded physics quizzes. "Hey, Dad," he called out, his voice reaching the kitchen before he did. There was a tightness to it, a barely contained frustration I recognized from years of parenting. Something had gone wrong, and he was bringing that energy into my quiet Sunday afternoon like a thundercloud. "Hey, Dad," Nathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration as he entered the kitchen. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, a gesture that reminded me of the little boy who used to do the same when struggling with a difficult math problem. Greenfield backed out. The whole Series B funding round just collapsed. I set down my red marking pen and removed my reading glasses. "I'm sorry to hear that, son. That's a tough break." Nathan paced the small kitchen, his expensive shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor. At 32, he looked more like his mother than me, tall and lean with sharp features and intense dark eyes. His hands moved constantly as he spoke, a trait he'd had since childhood. "A tough break? That's all you have to say? This is the third time, Dad. The third time I've gotten close only to watch it all fall apart." I pulled out a chair, gesturing for him to sit. "Why don't you tell me what happened? Maybe talking it through will help." He ignored the chair, continuing to pace. The kitchen that had once seemed spacious enough to contain our small family now felt cramped with his restless energy. His designer watch caught the afternoon light as he gestured, a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. "What happened is what always happens. I get so close and then something goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. That's often how business works," I offered gently. "Especially startups. It takes multiple attempts." "Don't," he cut me off, his voice hardening. "Don't give me the teacher speech about persistence and learning from failure. I'm not one of your students." I fell silent, recognizing the pattern forming. Nathan hadn't come for advice or even comfort. He'd come to vent, to release the pressure building inside him. And increasingly over the years, that pressure had found its release in blaming me. "You know what Zach Miller's father did when his son started a company?" Nathan asked, referring to a former classmate who'd found success early. He called every business contact he'd made in 30 years on Wall Street. Invested $500,000 himself. That's what a father who believes in his son does. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. I thought of the $40,000 I'd scraped together from my teacher's pension to invest in his first venture. How I'd co-signed his first apartment lease when he moved to the city. The countless hours spent proofreading business plans and practicing pitch presentations. I've always believed in you, Nathan, I said quietly. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that bounced off the worn kitchen cabinet. Belief doesn't fund companies, Dad. Connections do. Capital does. But what would you know about that? You spent your whole career in the same classroom making the same salary, playing it safe. The words stung, but I recognized them as deflections, his pain transformed into attacks. I'd seen this pattern since he was a teenager, this tendency to lash outward when feeling vulnerable. You chose to be a teacher, he continued, gaining momentum. You chose security over opportunity. Do you have any idea what it's like trying to make it in today's business world with no safety net? No connections? No real financial backing? I thought of the safety net I'd worked so hard to provide him, the stable home, the college education free from student loans, the emotional support through every setback. But now wasn't the time to list these things. His anger needed somewhere to land. If you had pushed me harder, he said, voice rising, or had any business connections, or saved enough to really invest in me, maybe I wouldn't keep failing. Maybe if you had been more ambitious yourself, you could have shown me how to succeed instead of just how to get by. The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp and undeserved. I felt a flicker of anger rise and then recede. Defending myself would only escalate his emotions, turning his momentary frustration into a lasting rift. And beneath my hurt was understanding. I recognized this wasn't really about me at all. This was about his fear of failure, his wounded pride, his struggle to find his place in a competitive world. So I said nothing. In my silence, something shifted in Nathan's expression, perhaps a flash of shame or recognition of how unfair his words had been. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by stubborn pride. "Forget it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair again. "You wouldn't understand anyway." He turned toward the refrigerator, opening it more from habit than hunger, scanning its contents just as he had as a teenager returning home from school. The familiarity of the gesture against the backdrop of his harsh words created a dissonance that ached somewhere deep in my chest. "I made stew," I said, nodding toward the slow cooker. "Your favorite recipe. Should be ready in about an hour if you want to stay for dinner." Nathan closed the refrigerator door, something complicated crossing his face, perhaps the memory of all the nights this simple meal had represented care and stability. "I can't," he said, his voice softer now but still distant. "I have a meeting with another potential investor. A Hail Mary, but I have to try." I nodded, not pushing. "Good luck with the meeting. You know where to find me if you need anything." He hesitated by the doorway, perhaps weighing whether to apologize, to acknowledge the unfairness of his outburst. Instead, he simply said, "I'll let you know how it goes," before walking out, leaving me alone with half-grated papers and a stew that would now last me the entire week. Through the window, I watched him slide into his leased luxury car, a status symbol he could barely afford but deemed necessary in the world he was trying to conquer. As he drove away, I returned to my grading, red pen marking incorrect answers with the same patient attention I'd always given both my students and my son. Some lessons, I knew, couldn't be taught directly. They had to be learned through experience, often painfully. And sometimes the most important thing a parent could do was simply to remain steady, to weather the storms of blame without becoming a casualty of them. I turned back to the physics quiz on the table, a question about action and reaction, about how forces always come in pairs. How fitting, I thought. Every push creates a pushback. Every word has its impact. And sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. After Nathan left that day, declining dinner with a muttered excuse about a meeting, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the beef stew simmering untouched. Einstein jumped into my lap, purring steadily as if offering comfort. I thought about my son's accusations, turning them over in my mind like stones in a river. Had I failed him by choosing teaching over a more lucrative career? Should I have pushed him harder? Made different sacrifices? The questions circled endlessly, until gradually they were replaced by a clearer perspective. I remembered staying up until midnight helping Nathan prepare for science competitions, then rising at dawn to grade papers before my first class. I recalled the baseball games I never missed despite faculty meetings, the school trips I chaperoned to ensure he could attend when money was tight. I thought of the quiet pride I'd felt watching him graduate college. The first in our family to do so, knowing the second mortgage on this house had made it possible. Outside, the October light was fading, casting long shadows across the backyard where Nathan had spent countless hours playing, studying, dreaming. The maple tree stood sentinel, its leaves a blaze of red and gold against the darkening sky, a reminder of how beautiful things can be even as they're letting go. I rose and moved to the living room, drawn to the bookshelf where photo albums chronicled our life together. One in particular caught my eye, a blue cloth-bound volume documenting Nathan's high school years. I pulled it down and settled into my worn armchair, Einstein immediately reclaiming his spot on my lap. The album opened to Nathan's science fair victory in 10th grade. His project on solar energy had taken first place, earning him a trip to the state competition. There we stood together, his grin wide and triumphant, my arm around his shoulders, both of us exhausted from the weeks of late-night work but exhilarated by the recognition of his efforts. What Nathan couldn't see, or perhaps couldn't acknowledge, was that my choices had been made with him at the center. Teaching hadn't been a lack of ambition but a deliberate choice that allowed me to be present for my son while still making a difference in the world. The stability he scorned had been my gift to him, the foundation from which he could take risks I never could. I turned the pages, watching Nathan grow through the chronology of photographs, from lanky teenager to confident young adult. Here he was receiving his acceptance letter to college, there in his graduation gown, then standing proudly in front of his first apartment in the city. Each image captured a moment of triumph that had been built on 1,000 invisible sacrifices and quiet encouragements. The last photo in the album was from the day he launched his first startup, standing in front of a whiteboard covered with ambitious projections and flowcharts, his expression a mixture of determination and hope. That venture had failed within 18 months, as had his second attempt. Now his third company teetered on the brink, another investor backing out, another dream threatening to crumble. As the evening shadows lengthened across my small living room, I came to a realization that brought both pain and peace. Nathan's inability to see my contributions wasn't my failure. It was simply part of his journey. Perhaps someday, when he had children of his own or simply gained the wisdom that comes with age, he would understand the different forms success and sacrifice can take. Until then, I would continue to show up. Not for recognition or gratitude, but because that's what fathers do. We love without condition or expectation of return. I closed the album and returned it to its place on the shelf. Then I picked up my red pen and returned to grading papers, small windows into the minds of students who still had so much to learn about life beyond formulas and equations. Tomorrow I would teach again. And in my own way, I would keep teaching my son too, even if the lessons might take years to be recognized. For the first time since Nathan's visit, I felt a sense of calm certainty. My worth wasn't determined by my son's acknowledgement or success. It existed independently of both, in the students whose lives I'd influenced, in the consistent presence I'd provided through Nathan's tumultuous journey, in the quiet integrity with which I'd faced our challenges. I didn't need Nathan to validate these truths. I simply needed to hold them for myself. In the 3 years that followed our confrontation, I watched Nathan's journey from a careful distance. Not withdrawing my support, but giving him the space to find his own way while I focused on preparing for my upcoming retirement. The school district had offered an early retirement package that made financial sense, especially given the arthritis that had begun making long days standing in the classroom increasingly difficult. After 30 years of teaching physics to teenagers, I would step away from the classroom that had defined much of my adult identity. The transition filled me with both anticipation and apprehension. I sold the house, the only home Nathan had really known, and downsized to a comfortable condo closer to the university where I'd arranged to teach one introductory physics course per semester. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The proceeds helped secure my retirement and, though Nathan didn't know it yet, established a small investment fund that would be there if he ever needed it again. Packing up 3 decades of life in that house proved both physically and emotionally demanding. Each room contained layers of memories. The kitchen where I'd taught Nathan to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, the living room where we'd built elaborate fort structures during rainy weekends, the backyard where he'd practiced pitching until dark. I found myself setting aside small items charged with particular significance: his first science fair ribbon, the model solar system we'd built together, a Father's Day card from when he was 9 that read "World's Smartest Dad" in careful childish script. The day the moving truck came, I stood in the empty house one last time, listening to the echoes of our life together reverberating through the bare rooms. A chapter was ending. What remained to be seen was whether a new one would begin with Nathan, or if our story together had largely been written. During this time, I followed Nathan's progress through occasional phone calls, social media updates, and news from mutual acquaintances. His new company was gaining traction, a software platform that helped small businesses compete with larger corporations through inventory management and sales analytics. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, who had criticized my small-scale life, was now dedicated to empowering other small operations. Our communications remained cordial but distant. I called on his birthday and major holidays. He responded with brief updates about his business and perfunctory questions about my retirement. Neither of us mentioned our argument or the underlying tensions it had revealed. The surface of our relationship had smoothed over, but the deeper currents remained unaddressed. I didn't offer unsolicited advice or remind him of past assistance. Instead, I sent brief, encouraging messages when he shared successes on social media. When he mentioned struggles during our occasional calls, I simply asked, "How can I help?" Sometimes receiving a request for feedback on a presentation or product description, often receiving nothing but a quick dismissal. Either way, I remained consistent, a steady presence at the periphery of his life. Meanwhile, I prepared in other ways. I read everything I could about his industry so I could understand his world better. I joined LinkedIn and other platforms where I could quietly support his professional posts without intrusion. I even took a basic coding class at the community college, not because I had any talent for it, but to better appreciate the complexity of what he was building. "You're going to an awful lot of trouble for someone who doesn't seem to appreciate it," my colleague Margaret remarked one day after I'd declined a dinner invitation to watch a live stream of Nathan's presentation at a tech conference. "I'm not doing it for appreciation," I replied, adjusting the angle of my laptop screen to better see Nathan confidently addressing the audience. "I'm doing it because he's my son." Margaret, who had never had children, studied me with a mixture of confusion and admiration. "I don't think I would be that forgiving." "It's not about forgiveness," I explained, watching Nathan field questions with the same quick intelligence he'd shown as a child. "It's about understanding that his journey isn't about me. My role is to support without expectation, not to demand recognition." The words, spoken aloud, crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. This was the essence of parenthood as I understood it, this unconditional witnessing of another person's life, This commitment to showing up regardless of whether your contribution is acknowledged or valued. When Nathan's company began attracting serious investor attention, I felt a pride that transcended our complicated relationship. I watched from afar as he navigated the business world with increasing confidence and skill. There were setbacks and victories, but through it all, I noticed a gradual maturing in his approach, less blaming of external factors, more strategic adaptation to challenges. The invitation to his acquisition celebration came unexpectedly, a formal card with gold embossing that arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. No personal note, just the printed details of the event and a response card. Still, it represented something significant, an acknowledgement of my existence in his life, however peripheral he might consider it. I bought a new suit for the occasion, nothing flashy, but well-tailored and appropriate for such an event. The night before the celebration, I carefully polished my dress shoes and prepared what I might say if given the opportunity to speak with my son properly. Not to remind him of past help or seek recognition, but simply to express how proud I was of what he had accomplished through his own persistence and talent. Regardless of what happens, I told Einstein as he watched me from the bed, tomorrow is about Nathan's success, not my contribution to it. The cat blinked slowly in response, his indifference somehow reassuring. As I laid out my clothes for the next day, I felt a strange sense of completion. Whatever happened at the celebration, a chapter was ending. Nathan had found his path to success. He no longer needed my protection from failure or disappointment. That was, in its own way, the ultimate success of a parent to become unnecessary. Yet as I turned out the light, I allowed myself to hope for something more, not gratitude or public acknowledgement, but perhaps a private moment of connection, a bridge between the world he had built and the foundation from which he had launched. The celebration was held at an upscale hotel in the city, its ballroom transformed into a showcase of Nathan's company achievements. Digital displays highlighted growth metrics and client testimonials. The company logo, a stylized bridge spanning a gap, adorned everything from cocktail napkins to the backdrop of the small stage where speeches would be given. I arrived early, choosing a spot near the back where I could observe without intruding. The room gradually filled with young professionals in expensive attire, venture capitalists with calculating eyes, and tech journalists capturing every detail. I recognized a few faces from photos Nathan had shared over the years, his core team members, key investors, the girlfriend who had supported him through the final stressful months before acquisition. The atmosphere hummed with success and possibility, champagne flowed freely, laughter punctuated the steady murmur of conversation, casual references to millions of dollars floated through the air like confetti. It was a world away from the faculty lounges and parent-teacher conferences that had defined my professional life, yet I felt a curious pride in Nathan's ability to navigate this environment with such apparent ease. Nathan himself moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. In his tailored charcoal suit and confident stance, he looked every bit the successful entrepreneur, a far cry from the frustrated young man who had stood in my kitchen 3 years earlier. I felt a surge of pride so intense it almost overwhelmed me. This was my son, brilliant, resilient, accomplished. Our eyes met briefly across the room. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement but made no move to approach me. I understood. This was his moment in a world where I was a foreigner. There would be time for conversation later. The formal program began with introductions from the acquiring company's CEO, followed by presentations on future integration plans. Finally, Nathan took the stage to thunderous applause. Under the spotlight, he looked both older and younger somehow. The successful businessman and the little boy who had once beamed at Science Fair awards merged into one. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady and clear through the microphone, this company was nothing but an idea and a lot of determination. Today we're part of one of the largest tech firms in the world. That journey from concept to acquisition wasn't a straight line. There were failures, painful, public failures, before we found our path to success. I thought of our argument, his bitter words about failure and my responsibility for it. How far he had come in accepting the winding nature of achievement. I want to take this opportunity to thank the people who made this possible, Nathan continued. First, our investors, who took a chance on an unproven concept and a founder with a less-than-perfect track record. He named them one by one, acknowledging specific contributions beyond mere funding. Next came his team members, each recognized for their unique skills and dedication. He thanked his girlfriend, Emily, for keeping me human when I threatened to become nothing but code and pitch decks. He even mentioned his high school baseball coach for teaching me that persistence matters more than natural talent. As the list of acknowledgments continued without my name, I felt a complex emotion that wasn't quite hurt but something more nuanced, a recognition that in Nathan's narrative of his life, my role had been minimized to the point of invisibility. The sacrifices, the support, the steadfast presence, none of it registered as contributory to his success in his mind. And yet, watching him stand confidently before this crowd of admirers, I couldn't summon resentment. This was what I had worked for all those years. Not recognition, but his independence and success. The fact that he couldn't see my fingerprints on his achievement was, in its own way, testament to how seamlessly that support had been integrated into his life. As applause signaled the end of the formal program, I moved toward the exit, planning to slip away quietly. Nathan had his world now, and it was right that he should celebrate without the complication of our unresolved tensions. But before I could reach the door, I heard his voice behind me. "You're leaving already?" I turned to find him standing closer than he had been in years, his expression unreadable. "I thought I should let you enjoy your moment," I replied. "It's a remarkable achievement, Nathan. Truly." He hesitated, glancing around at the celebrating crowd before returning his attention to me. "I saw you sitting in the back during my speech." I nodded, unsure where this was heading. "You didn't expect to be mentioned, did you?" he asked, a strange note in his voice I couldn't quite interpret. The question caught me off guard with its directness. "It was your story to tell," I said carefully. "Your achievement to celebrate." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "That's not really an answer." "No," I admitted. "I didn't expect to be mentioned. And that's okay." Something flickered across his face, perhaps surprise at my honesty, or relief that I wasn't making demands on his narrative. He opened his mouth, as if to say something more, then closed it as one of his team members approached with an important investor in tow. "We'll talk later," he said, already turning toward his responsibilities. "Don't leave yet." I found a quiet corner and waited, watching him navigate his success with skill and confidence. Whether our conversation would actually happen remained to be seen, but I had learned long ago that with Nathan, patience was its own form of love. The celebration continued around me, a swirl of congratulations and strategic networking thinly disguised as casual conversation. I nursed a single glass of champagne, feeling simultaneously part of and separate from the proceedings, much like my role in Nathan's life itself. After about an hour, when I was seriously considering a quiet departure despite Nathan's request to stay, he reappeared at my side. His tie was slightly loosened, his earlier polish softened by the exertion of being the center of attention for so long. "Let's find somewhere quieter," he suggested, gesturing toward a small seating area separated from the main ballroom. The alcove offered relative privacy. Plush chairs arranged around a low table, the ambient noise of the party reduced to a manageable hum. Nathan sat across from me, setting down 2 fresh glasses of champagne he'd brought along. For a moment, we sat in silence. I noted the subtle signs of exhaustion beneath his triumphant exterior, the slight shadows under his eyes, the tension he carried in his shoulders even now. Success, I knew, carried its own weight. "Your speech was excellent," I offered, giving him an easy opening. Clear, gracious, forward-looking. But incomplete, he replied, surprising me with his directness. That's what you're not saying, isn't it? I shook my head. It was your moment, Nathan. Your story to tell as you see it. As I see it, he repeated thoughtfully. That's the thing, Dad. I'm beginning to realize that how I see things might not always align with reality. He took a sip of champagne, gathering his thoughts. I waited, having learned long ago that my son processed important realizations in his own time, at his own pace. 3 years ago, in your kitchen, I said some terrible things. He finally continued. About you holding me back. About your choices somehow causing my failures. The memory still carried its sting, but I kept my expression neutral. You were frustrated. People say things they don't mean when they're facing setbacks. No, Nathan said firmly. Don't do that. Don't excuse it away. I knew exactly what I was saying, and I said it specifically to hurt you because I couldn't face my own responsibility for those failures. His honesty caught me off guard. This was a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected. The thing is, he continued, building this company taught me something important. Success isn't just about the big, visible moves. The funding rounds, the product launches, the media coverage. It's built on a foundation of small, consistent actions that nobody sees or celebrates. He leaned forward slightly. Sound familiar? I felt a tightness in my throat but remained silent, letting him continue his thought. When I was blaming you for not giving me some magic key to success, I was completely missing what you had actually given me. Nathan's voice softened. The ability to show up every day. The discipline to keep going when things get difficult. The integrity to do what's right even when it costs you personally. He gestured toward the ballroom beyond our alcove. Everyone out there thinks this happened in 3 years. But the truth is, it's been 32 years in the making. I just couldn't see it until recently. What changed? I asked, curious about this shift in perspective. Nathan smiled faintly. About 6 months ago, I was working with a small family business, potential clients for our platform. The owner kept rescheduling our meetings because he was attending his daughter's school event. One of our sales team wanted to drop them, said they weren't serious enough. He paused, swirling the champagne in his glass. And suddenly I remembered all the science competitions you never missed. The baseball games you attended straight from teaching. How you somehow managed to be everywhere that mattered in my life, while still supporting us. The revelation in his voice was genuine, not performed for my benefit, but a true recognition dawning. I didn't thank you in my speech tonight, Nathan said, meeting my eyes directly. Not because you don't deserve acknowledgement, but because what you've given me is too fundamental, too essential to be reduced to a line in a thank you list between investors and colleagues. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small box, placing it on the table between us. This is for you. I opened it carefully to find a simple silver keychain with the company logo, the bridge spanning a gap. Every employee gets one when we close a major deal, Nathan explained. It's to remind us that our work is about building connections, spanning divide. But this one is special. He reached over and turned it in my hand to reveal an engraving on the back, a simple equation, E=mc². I looked up, questioning. Einstein's most famous equation, Nathan explained. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. You taught it to me when I was 12, and I didn't really get it. But you said something I never forgot. It means that inside even the smallest thing, there's enormous power waiting to be released. I remembered that conversation, one of many science discussions at our kitchen table. I hadn't realized it had stayed with him. That's what you did, Dad, Nathan said quietly. You saw the potential energy in me even when I couldn't see it myself. You provided the conditions that allowed it to be released. Not with grand gestures or connections or massive investments, but with something much more valuable: consistency, belief, and presence. The simple truth of his words washed over me, not just the acknowledgement of my contribution, but the deeper recognition of what truly matters in the formation of a person's character and capabilities. I didn't need to thank you tonight, Nathan concluded, because your fingerprints are on everything I've accomplished, whether anyone else can see them or not. Including, for a long time, me. The conversation in that quiet alcove marked a turning point, but real change requires more than moments of clarity. It demands consistent action. Over the weeks that followed, Nathan and I began rebuilding our relationship with intention and awareness that it began with a standing Sunday phone call, a small commitment that signaled larger priorities. These weren't lengthy, emotional discussions, but regular check-ins that gradually rebuilt the habit of connection we had lost somewhere between his adolescence and adulthood. I'm trying to establish better routines, Nathan explained during one such call. The company's bigger now, more complex. If I don't deliberately make time for what matters, it simply doesn't happen. That's a lesson most people learn much later in life, if at all, I observed. Intentionality is underrated. 1 month after the acquisition celebration, Nathan invited me to lunch. Not at an impressive restaurant designed to showcase his success, but at a small diner halfway between our homes. The kind of place where the coffee comes in thick ceramic mugs and the waitresses call everyone honey, regardless of age or status. We sat at a corner booth, surrounded by the ambient sounds of normal life, orders being called, coffee being poured, everyday conversations about weather and local sports teams. The normalcy felt refreshing after the rarefied atmosphere of the celebration party. I have a proposition for you, Nathan said after we'd ordered. A business proposition, actually. I raised an eyebrow, curious. I'm listening. Part of our expansion plan involves educational outreach. Teaching small business owners how to leverage technology without getting overwhelmed by it. We've been trying to develop training modules, but something's missing. And what's that? I asked, though I was beginning to see where this was headed. The ability to explain complex concepts clearly to people who don't have the background knowledge. To create an environment where questions are welcome, where learning feels safe. Nathan smiled. In other words, we need a teacher. The offer was clear, a consulting role with his company, using my decades of educational experience to help shape their training program. It was a genuine opportunity, not charity disguised as business. I'd need to think about it, I said honestly. I've just started adjusting to retirement. Nathan nodded. Take all the time you need. But know that this isn't about obligation or guilt. We actually need what you're good at. Over the following days, I considered his proposal carefully. There was appeal in the challenge, in applying my teaching skills to a new context. But more significant was what the offer represented. Nathan's recognition of my value not just as his father, but as a professional with expertise worth respecting. When I accepted the position, we established clear parameters. I would work remotely, maintaining my independence while contributing meaningfully to his company's mission. My input would be treated with the same professional consideration given to any team member, and no special treatment, but no dismissal either. This new dynamic, father and son, but also colleagues of a sort, gave us neutral ground where we could relate as adults with mutual respect. During video meetings, I watched Nathan lead his team with a balanced approach that somehow reminded me of my classroom management style, firm but fair, focused on bringing out the best in people rather than simply extracting productivity. You're good at this, I told him after a particularly effective session. Leading people, I mean. I had a decent role model, he replied, the compliment offered casually but sincerely. These small moments of recognition accumulated gradually, building a new foundation for our relationship, one based not on obligation or history alone, but on genuine appreciation for each other's strengths and contributions. As we worked together, I began to see more clearly how much of my influence had shaped Nathan's approach to business, despite his earlier rejection of my values. His emphasis on ethical practices. His patience with team members who needed extra support. His insistence on creating products that genuinely helped people rather than merely extracting profit. These weren't traits he had learned in business school or from venture capitalists. One evening, after reviewing a particularly challenging training module, Nathan mentioned something that revealed how deeply this reconciliation process was affecting him. "I'm thinking about mentoring some kids from disadvantaged backgrounds," he said. "Teaching them coding, business basics, that sort of thing." "That sounds worthwhile," I replied, careful not to overreact to this significant shift in his priorities. "Any particular reason?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. About impact that goes beyond balance sheets and acquisition deals." Another pause, longer this time. "And I've been thinking about what you once told me, that success isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute. I think I finally understand what that means." In that simple statement, I heard the echo of countless dinner table conversations, of values planted long ago finally taking root. Not because I had demanded their acceptance, but because Nathan had come to recognize their truth through his own experience. This was the real inheritance I had always hoped to pass on, not wealth or connections, but a compass for navigating life's complexities with integrity and purpose. As months passed, our professional collaboration evolved alongside our personal reconnection. The educational platform we developed together became an unexpected success, drawing positive attention from both the tech industry and the educational sector. Articles were written about the innovative approach, the blending of pedagogical best practices with cutting-edge technology. In one prominent industry magazine, Nathan was interviewed about the initiative. When asked what inspired the program's distinctive approach, he responded without hesitation, "My father spent 30 years in education. I finally had the good sense to listen to him. He sent me the article with no comment, none was needed." The public acknowledgement wasn't important in itself, but what it represented was significant. Nathan was no longer separating his origin story from his success story. He was integrating them, recognizing that his achievements weren't in spite of his background but partially because of it. Our Sunday calls continued, gradually expanding beyond work discussions to include more personal topics. Nathan began asking questions about his childhood, about my experiences as a young teacher, about what his mother had been like before she left. Not with bitterness or blame, but with genuine curiosity about the foundations of his own life. "I realized I never really asked about your journey," he explained during one such conversation. "I was so focused on my own path that I never considered yours." This new interest extended beyond words. Nathan began showing up, just as I had shown up for him throughout his childhood. He visited my condo unannounced one weekend to help install shelving in my home office. He remembered my birthday without prompting for the first time in years, arranging a small dinner with a few of my former colleagues he had tracked down. These gestures weren't grand or showy, they were simply evidence of attention and care, of making space in his busy life for our relationship. The most profound change, however, was in how we navigated disagreements. The pattern of blame that had characterized our interactions for so long had been replaced by something healthier, the ability to express different perspectives without defensive reactions or attributions of malicious intent. During one video conference about the educational platform, we had a fundamental disagreement about the assessment methodology. In the past, such conflict might have devolved into personal attacks or sullen withdrawal. Instead, Nathan listened to my concerns, offered his counterarguments, and we eventually developed a hybrid approach that was stronger than either of our original positions. "That was actually productive," he remarked afterward, sounding slightly surprised. "We disagreed without it becoming a thing about our relationship." "That's what happens when you're secure enough in your own worth that you don't need to be right all the time," I replied. Something that took me many years to learn myself. As our professional project neared completion, I began to consider my next step. The consulting role had been fulfilling, but I recognized the importance of not becoming too enmeshed in Nathan's professional world. Our reconciliation was strongest when each of us maintained our own identity and boundaries. "I'm thinking about writing a book," I told Nathan during one of our Sunday calls, "about teaching science to students who think they can't learn it." "You should absolutely do that," he responded enthusiastically. "Your approaches work. We've seen the data from the training platform." The conversation shifted to practical considerations, publishing options, potential audiences, schedule, and structure. Nathan offered connections to people in publishing he'd met through business channels, but was careful to frame these as resources I could use or decline as I saw fit. No pressure, no expectations, just support. This was perhaps the most healing development in our relationship, the establishment of mutual respect for each other's autonomy and expertise. Nathan was no longer the struggling son seeking validation, nor I the father whose worth was measured by his child's success. We had become two distinct individuals with our own contributions to make, connected by both biology and choice. One evening, as we finished a particularly productive work session, Nathan mentioned something that crystallized how far we had come. "You know," he said casually, "someone asked me recently who my role model was growing up. Without even thinking about it, I said my dad. It just came out naturally." I must have looked surprised because he laughed. "Don't look so shocked. It's always been true, even when I was too stubborn to admit it. Even during those years when you thought I represented everything you didn't want to become?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than seeking affirmation. Nathan considered this seriously. "I think especially during those years," he finally replied. "Because no matter how I pushed you away or dismissed your choices, you remained exactly who you were: consistent, ethical, patient. You never tried to be someone else to impress me or win my approval. That kind of integrity is rare." He shook his head slightly, as if still processing this realization himself. "It took me becoming secure in my own identity to recognize the strength in yours." In that moment, I understood that our reconciliation wasn't simply about healing past wounds or acknowledging contributions. It was about recognizing each other as complete individuals, flawed but worthy, different but connected. It was about the power of being seen truly and choosing connection anyway. Nathan had found success by society's standards: wealth, recognition, influence. I had found it through different measures: impact on young minds, integrity maintained through challenges, a life of purpose rather than prestige. We had each chosen different paths, but were finally able to see the value in both journeys. 6 months after the acquisition celebration, Nathan's company hosted a major education summit, bringing together technology leaders, educators, and policy makers to discuss the future of learning in a digital world. The event represented the official launch of the training platform we had developed together, now expanded into a broader educational initiative. Nathan had asked me to be one of the keynote speakers, focusing on bridging the gap between traditional teaching methodologies and technological innovation. It was a significant opportunity, placing me before an audience of influential figures who could amplify the approaches I had developed over decades in a classroom. The summit was held at a prestigious university conference center, a setting that blended academic tradition with modern functionality. As I prepared in the speaker's lounge, adjusting my tie and reviewing my notes one final time, I felt a curious sense of completion. My work as an educator had always been important to me, but largely invisible beyond the walls of my classroom. Now, those same ideas would reach a much wider audience through this platform Nathan had helped create. Nathan appeared at the door, dressed in a suit that somehow managed to look both professional and creative, much like the man himself these days. "Ready?" he asked, his expression showing genuine interest rather than just courtesy. "As I'll ever be," I replied. Though I still think it's ironic that after 30 years of trying to get teenagers to pay attention to what I'm saying, I now have to convince tech executives to listen. Nathan laughed. Just imagine them all in their underwear. That's terrible advice and you know it, I countered with a smile. Besides, I taught high school physics. I learned long ago that confidence comes from knowing your material, not from imagining your audience in compromising situations. This easy banter between us felt like a gift, the natural rapport of two adults who respected each other, not the careful diplomatic exchanges of our recent past. As we walked toward the auditorium, Nathan's phone buzzed with messages that required his attention, last-minute summit details needing resolution. He dealt with each efficiently, delegating where appropriate, handling himself what needed his specific input. I watched him with quiet pride, noting how he'd learned to manage pressure without becoming consumed by it. Sorry about that, he said, putting his phone away as we approached the stage entrance. Everything's under control now. You're good at this, I observed. The whole leadership thing. He shrugged slightly. I had a good teacher. Before I could respond, the moderator began introducing me to the packed auditorium. Nathan squeezed my shoulder briefly, a small gesture of support, then moved to take his seat in the front row. I stepped onto the stage to polite applause, facing a sea of faces representing the intersection of education and technology. My presentation focused on what 30 years of teaching had taught me about how people learn, the importance of making mistakes, the value of questions over answers, the necessity of meeting learners where they are rather than where you wish they were. Throughout my talk, I was aware of Nathan in the front row, listening intently, nodding at key points. Not performatively for my benefit, but genuinely engaged with the ideas being presented. When the time came for questions, he didn't dominate or intervene. He allowed the session to unfold naturally, trusting me to handle whatever came my way. After the presentation, as we moved through the networking reception, I watched Nathan introduce me to his colleagues and industry peers not as my dad, but as James Wilson, whose educational methodology forms the backbone of our training platform. Each introduction acknowledged both my professional contribution and our personal connection without diminishing either. Late that evening, as the summit's first day concluded, Nathan and I found ourselves alone on the university's central quad. The spring air carried the scent of newly cut grass and distant flowering trees. Campus buildings glowed warmly against the darkening sky, their windows illuminated by late-working students and faculty. It went well today, Nathan said, hands in his pockets as we walked slowly along a tree-lined path. Your session had the highest engagement metrics of any presentation. Is that how you measure success these days? I asked, gently teasing. Engagement metrics? He laughed. Occupational hazard. But seriously, people connected with what you were saying. It wasn't just theoretical, it was practical, human. We walked in comfortable silence for a moment, our footsteps in sync without conscious effort. You know, Nathan finally said, 3 years ago, I blamed you for my failures because it was easier than facing my own shortcomings. But the truth is, any success I have now is built on the foundation you provided. The statement was offered not as a dramatic confession but as a simple acknowledgement of fact, all the more meaningful for its matter-of-fact delivery. That's how it works, I replied. Each generation stands on the shoulders of the one before. You're meant to go further than I did, Nathan. That's the natural order of things. Maybe, he said thoughtfully. But further doesn't always mean what I thought it meant. I used to think success was just about metrics, money, status, recognition. Now I'm not so sure. We reached the center of the quad, where a small fountain burbled quietly in the evening stillness. The sound reminded me of summer afternoons in our backyard, the sprinkler creating arcs of water while a young Nathan ran through them, laughing. What do you think it means now? I asked. Nathan considered the question seriously. I think maybe success is about integration. about bringing together all the parts of yourself, your work, your relationships, your values, into something cohesive. About creating something that wouldn't exist without your specific contribution. I nodded, recognizing in his words an understanding that had taken me decades to achieve. That sounds about right. You know what's funny? Nathan continued. I spent years thinking I needed to reject your example to find my own path. Now I realize I can honor what you taught me while still forging my own way. The simple wisdom of his statement. This recognition that influence and independence aren't mutually exclusive, represented the culmination of our journey together. The angry young man who had once blamed me for his failures had become an adult capable of acknowledging both his debts and his autonomy. As we turned back toward the conference center, where drivers waited to take us to our respective homes, Nathan cleared his throat slightly. I've been thinking about how I never thanked you publicly that night at the acquisition celebration, he said. And I want you to know that tomorrow, when I give the closing address, I plan to acknowledge your influence, both on me personally and on the educational platform we've built together. I shook my head. That's not necessary, Nathan. I know where I stand now. It's not about necessity, he replied firmly. It's about truth. And the truth is, I wouldn't be who I am without you. The world should know that. In that moment, I realized that Nathan's desire to acknowledge me publicly wasn't about soothing my ego or alleviating his guilt. It was about integrity, about aligning his public narrative with his private understanding. It was, in its way, the final piece of his own integration. In that case, I said, I would be honored. We had arrived at the point where our paths would temporarily diverge. As we shook hands, the formality gradually giving way to a brief, slightly awkward hug, I felt the full circle of our journey together. The little boy I had raised had become a man capable of both independence and gratitude, of charting his own course while acknowledging his origins. See you tomorrow, Nathan said as he stepped toward his waiting car. I'll be there, I replied, the simple promise carrying echoes of all the baseball games, science fairs, and graduations where I had shown up for him throughout his life. I always am. The next day, Nathan delivered the summit's closing address to a packed auditorium. His presentation was polished and engaging, focusing on the future of the educational platform and its potential impact on small businesses worldwide. As he neared the conclusion, he paused, his expression becoming more thoughtful. Before I wrap up today, he said, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. We've been talking about innovation and disruption for 2 days, about breaking new ground and creating new paradigms. But innovation doesn't emerge from nothing. It builds on foundations laid by others. The room quieted, sensing the shift toward something more personal. 3 years ago, Nathan continued, my company was struggling. During that difficult time, I blamed my father for my failures. I told him that if he had been more ambitious, more connected, more financially successful, I might not be failing myself. I sat very still in my seat, surprised by the public acknowledgement of our private conflict. What I didn't understand then was that my father, James Wilson, who spoke so brilliantly yesterday about educational methodology, had given me something far more valuable than connections or startup capital. He had given me a model of persistence, integrity, and meaningful contribution. Nathan's gaze found me in the audience, his expression open and sincere. Dad taught high school physics for 30 years. He showed up for every class, every parent meeting, every science competition. He raised me alone after my mother left, never missing a baseball game or school event despite his demanding schedule. And he did all this not for recognition or reward, but because he believed in the value of consistent, meaningful work. The audience was completely silent now, engaged by this unexpected turn in what had been a fairly standard business presentation. The platform we've launched at this summit, the one that's receiving such positive response, is built on educational principles my father developed over decades in the classroom. principles about meeting people where they are, about making complex concepts accessible, about the importance of questions over answers. Nathan smiled slightly. It took me far too long to recognize that my father's version of success, measured in lives influenced rather than dollars accumulated, was just as valid as the metrics we celebrate in the business world. Perhaps more so. As Nathan continued, expressing gratitude for my influence both personal and professional, I felt a sense of peaceful completion. Not because my son was finally acknowledging me publicly, though that was certainly gratifying, but because he had truly integrated the lessons of his upbringing with his own path forward. The acknowledgement wasn't about me. It was evidence of Nathan's growth into his fullest self. After the summit concluded, life settled into a new pattern. Nathan's company continued to thrive, expanding its educational initiatives while maintaining its core business services. My book on science education gradually took shape, enriched by insights gained from our collaboration. We maintained our Sunday calls, neither obligatory nor performative but genuinely valued by both of us. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after the summit, Nathan called with unexpected news. "Emily's pregnant," he said, his voice conveying both excitement and a touch of anxiety. "We're going to have a daughter." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely delighted. "Congratulations to both of you." "Thanks," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "Dad, I'm not sure I know how to do this. Be a father, I mean." The vulnerability in his voice. This successful man suddenly confronting the most fundamental human challenge touched me deeply. "Nobody really knows at first," I assured him. "You figure it out day by day, decision by decision." "But what if I make mistakes?" The question carried echoes of his younger self, always afraid of failure. "You will," I said simply. "That's guaranteed. But mistakes aren't failures, Nathan. They're how we learn, how we adjust, how we become better." A thoughtful silence stretched between us. Then, "Will you help me? I mean, be involved, give advice when I need it? I don't want to repeat the cycle of." He trailed off, not needing to elaborate on his mother's absence. "Of course," I promised. "But Nathan, you should know something. You're already better prepared than you think. You've learned how to build things that last, how to lead with integrity, how to acknowledge your mistakes and grow from them. Those are exactly the skills fatherhood requires." 6 months later, I stood in a hospital room, watching Nathan hold his newborn daughter for the first time. The wonder in his expression as he counted her tiny fingers, the careful way he cradled her head, the soft words he whispered to her, promises of protection and presence, all spoke to the man he had become. "Dad," he said, looking up at me with tears in his eyes, "I get it now. I finally understand." No further explanation was necessary. In that moment of holding new life, of feeling the weight of responsibility and the immensity of love simultaneously, Nathan had gained the perspective that only parenthood provides. He understood now what had driven my choices, what had defined my version of success, what had made showing up, even when unacknowledged, so essential. As I watched my son with his daughter, I recognized the true resolution of our story. It wasn't about receiving credit or having my contributions finally acknowledged. It was about passing forward the most important lessons, that love manifests in presence, that success is measured in impact, and that our greatest achievements often go unrecognized until they bear fruit in the next generation. If my story resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever supported someone who couldn't acknowledge your contribution? Have you later received unexpected recognition that came when you no longer needed it? Or perhaps you've been the one who failed to see the silent support that made your success possible. Remember that the most profound influences in our lives often go uncredited in our success stories. The teacher who believed in you before you believed in yourself. The parent who provided stability rather than spectacle. The friend who offered honest criticism when flattery would have been easier. True impact rarely aligns with immediate recognition. The most important contributions often work beneath the surface, like roots supporting a tree that others admire for its height and beauty. If you're providing that foundational support for someone, whether as a parent, mentor, teacher, or friend, know that your influence matters even when it goes unacknowledged. And if you've been fortunate enough to achieve success, take a moment to trace the roots of your achievements. Look beyond the obvious contributors to find those quiet, consistent presences who shaped your character, instilled your values, or simply showed up when showing up mattered most. The most powerful legacy isn't built through grand gestures or public accolades, but through consistent presence and principled action. It's measured not in the immediate applause it generates, but in how it continues to shape lives long after we're gone. That's the lesson my son finally learned, and the one I hope you'll take from our story.